Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, comment where are you from and what time are you watching. Now get comfortable and relax. It was the type of antique shop you'd pass by without a second thought. Small, cluttered, and hidden away in the side streets of the city, like a forgotten relic of a different time. The wooden sign hanging above the door simply read, "Curiosities and Oddities." Dust clung to the windows, and the faint smell of old leather and mothballs seeped out every time the door creaked open. The owner, a wiry man named Alden, was a figure who seemed to belong to a time long past. His gray hair disheveled, and his clothes always slightly too old-fashioned, as though he were stuck in another era. He never smiled, and rarely spoke unless it was necessary, but there was something magnetic about his presence. Some customers, like Melanie, found themselves drawn to him without quite understanding why. Melanie had always been fascinated by the mysterious. She wasn't superstitious, but she'd always been intrigued by tales of curses, past lives, and things that shouldn't be explained. She had been walking down the street one evening when her attention was drawn to the small shop. A faint glimmer of gold caught her eye through the dusty window, a reflection of something that seemed almost alive. It was the kind of moment that didn't feel like coincidence. Something about it called to her, so she walked in. As the door swung open, the musty scent filled her nostrils, making her feel as though she had stepped into a time capsule. The walls were lined with shelves packed to the brim with forgotten artifacts. There were tarnished silver goblets, ancient maps, dusty books, and strange statuettes from civilizations long gone. Yet, it was the mirror that drew her gaze, an ornate piece, framed with intricately carved wood, its edges curling into patterns that almost seemed to breathe. It stood alone in the farthest corner of the shop, as if it had been placed there on purpose, waiting for her. Alden appeared from the shadows, his eyes flickering to Melanie's face before he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Ah, you found it." Melanie hesitated, her heart beating faster. The mirror was beautiful in a way she couldn't quite place. There was something about the way it gleamed, despite the dim light in the shop. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. "It's magnificent," she said, her voice soft. Alden nodded. "It's more than that. This mirror doesn't simply reflect the present. It shows past lives, the lives of those who stand before it." Melanie frowned, not quite sure if she was being mocked. "Past lives?" The man's eyes darkened, and he took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not everyone who gazes into it is able to handle what they see. Sometimes, the mirror shows more than just memories. It shows shadows. You might find yourself followed." Melanie laughed nervously, stepping back from the mirror. "I'm not superstitious. I'm just looking for something interesting." Alden tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Many think like you, until they look. I must warn you, though, once you've seen the reflections, you cannot unsee them." Despite the warning, Melanie felt an odd pull toward the mirror. Something inside her urged her to take the risk, to uncover whatever secret lay behind its reflective surface. She turned back to Alden. "How much?" He didn't hesitate. $200. She reached into her purse without thinking, pulling out the money and handing it over. She didn't know why she was so willing to pay for a simple mirror, but there was a strange sense of destiny in the air. Alden, with his unblinking gaze, simply nodded and handed her the mirror. Back in her apartment, Melanie carefully placed the mirror on the wall opposite her bed. The room felt different now, as though the space had shifted in some subtle way. She couldn't explain it, but the air seemed thicker, as if the very room itself was holding its breath. She tried to shake off the feeling and decided to focus on her evening routine. As the night drew on, Melanie sat on her bed with her book, but her eyes kept wandering back to the mirror. It wasn't even the reflection of herself that caught her attention. It was the sensation that there was more. Something behind her own reflection, something watching. She told herself it was nothing, just the natural quiet of the apartment amplifying her imagination. But still, her eyes drifted again, and this time, she couldn't ignore the strange sensation. The reflection wasn't quite right. The image in the mirror seemed to flicker, like an old film reel with a burn. Melanie stood and moved closer, squinting at the glass. In the reflection, she saw herself, dressed differently, in clothes that didn't belong to her current time. Her hair was styled differently, longer and darker. She blinked and leaned in, trying to make sense of the reflection. But as she did, the image shifted, like a shadow moving behind her. The flicker was gone, replaced with a dark silhouette, a figure that didn't belong. A chill ran down her spine. She reached out to touch the glass, but the moment her fingers made contact, the image in the mirror seemed to warp again, and she yanked her hand away. Her heart raced in her chest. Had she just imagined that? Or was there something else in the reflection? For the next few days, Melanie became obsessed with the mirror. Every glance, every fleeting moment, she would find herself staring into it, waiting for the same haunting reflection. And sure enough, it came. The shadow, that figure. She saw it again, but this time it was clearer, more defined. A man, dressed in the same outdated clothing as she had seen in the reflection before. His eyes were cold, unblinking, staring directly at her. His expression was neutral, but there was something inherently wrong about him. Melanie's thoughts raced. Who was this man? Was it someone from her past life? Was this what Alden had meant? She couldn't ignore it anymore, the sense that this figure was somehow linked to her, that they were connected. As the days passed, Melanie couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The figure in the mirror was no longer just a fleeting image. It was becoming real. She saw him whenever she looked into the glass, standing in the background of her reflection, as if he were waiting. It was then that things began to spiral. The subtle flickers of movement in the mirror turned into more than just passing moments. She started to see the man in her peripheral vision. At first, it was just a shadow moving in the corner of her eye, but soon it was a full figure, tall, gaunt, and always staring at her with those cold eyes. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was her imagination playing tricks on her, but then strange things began to happen. Small items around her apartment would be moved. A cup would be shifted across the table when she hadn't touched it. Her keys would be gone, only to turn up in a place she was sure she hadn't left them. Then came the dreams. Every night, she would sleep but never truly rest. She would dream of the man from the mirror. In the dreams, he wasn't just a passive observer. He was alive, moving, following her through the streets of a town that seemed impossibly familiar, yet unfamiliar all at once. She would run, but he would always be right behind her, his footsteps growing louder and louder until they reached a dead end, and she would wake up in a cold sweat. The days passed, and Melanie became consumed by the mirror. She could no longer pretend that it was all in her head. The man, the figure in the glass, was real. He was there in every reflection, in every dream, and now in her waking hours. She had tried calling Alden, but he hadn't answered. She was alone, left to fend for herself. But how could she escape something that followed her everywhere? It wasn't until she awoke one morning to a new, terrifying reality that she understood just how deep her entanglement with the mirror went. She was lying in bed, groggy from a fitful night of dreams, when she glanced at the mirror across the room. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting long, lazy beams of gold onto the wooden floor. The reflection, as always, showed her figure sitting up in bed, her eyes still heavy with sleep. But this time, something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't moving in sync with her body. She watched in a rising sense of dread as her reflection slowly turned its head toward her, a sinister smile creeping across its face. She froze, unable to move, unable to scream. Her reflection, the one that had always seemed so passive, was now alive, aware, and evil. The smile grew wider, the eyes colder, darker, almost mocking her terror. In a panic, she jumped out of bed and rushed toward the mirror, expecting to see the familiar image of herself. But it wasn't her. It was him. The figure, the man from her dreams, stood in place of her reflection. His eyes locked onto hers through the glass, and for the first time, she heard his voice. It was deep, distorted, as though it came from somewhere far away and yet, at the same time, so painfully close. "You can't escape," he whispered, the words echoing in her mind. Melanie backed away from the mirror, stumbling as her hands grabbed at her hair, her body shaking uncontrollably. It was all real. This wasn't a figment of her imagination. She was being hunted by this entity from the past, and there was no escaping him. The days that followed were a blur of terror. Melanie couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time she tried to doze off, the nightmares would come, more vivid and suffocating than before. The man from the mirror haunted her in every corner of her mind. When she closed her eyes, his cold, lifeless gaze was all she saw. It wasn't just the mirror anymore, it was everything. Her reflection followed her in every surface of glass, in every window, in every polished piece of furniture. She couldn't escape him, couldn't outrun him. His presence was inescapable. One night, she found herself sitting in front of the mirror again, unable to resist its pull. She stared at her reflection, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The room felt heavier, as though the very air was thickening around her. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the reflection began to distort, flickering as it had before. But this time, something was different. The man appeared in the glass again, his eyes locked on hers, but now he was not standing still. He was moving. He was stepping out of the mirror. A wave of horror washed over her as she realized what was happening. The man wasn't confined to the mirror anymore. He was crossing over, and she was powerless to stop it. The glass shimmered like water rippling, and his arms slowly extended out from the frame. His fingers, long and thin, curled in her direction. She screamed, but no sound came. Her mouth moved, but the scream was silent, swallowed by the oppressive stillness in the room. His other hand emerged from the glass, followed by his shoulder, his chest, until he was completely outside the mirror, standing before her. His body was unnaturally tall, his movements too slow, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. His face was twisted, like a distorted reflection of humanity. His smile spread wider, showing teeth that seemed too sharp, too many. And then he spoke, his voice low and guttural. "You're mine now." Desperation took hold. Melanie ran, but the man no. The thing followed her with unnatural speed, its long limbs stretching unnervingly as it pursued her through the apartment. She crashed through the door, but no matter where she turned, it was always behind her, inescapable. She stumbled into the living room, her heart racing in her chest, but when she turned to look, the figure was no longer behind her. He was standing at the far end of the room, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. Her mind raced, trying to think of any way to escape, any way to stop this nightmare. Her thoughts wandered back to Alden, the strange, cryptic warnings he had given her. Could he have known this would happen? Could the curse have been passed down intentionally? It didn't make sense, but something in her gut told her it wasn't a coincidence. There had to be a way to break free. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around the room. It was then that she noticed the strange old book she had picked up from the shelf earlier that week, tucked away in a corner. It looked like it belonged to another time, worn, old, and bound in dark leather. She hadn't paid it any attention until now, but now it felt as though the book was calling to her. She grabbed it without hesitation and opened it. The pages were yellowed, filled with strange symbols and faded ink. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes fell upon an incantation, one that promised to sever the connection between a person and the mirror's curse. Her hands shook as she read the words aloud, unsure of what she was invoking. The room seemed to grow colder, darker, and the air grew thick with the tension of something ancient being disturbed. The figure in the room watched, unmoving, as she finished the incantation. For a moment there was silence. Then the room trembled. The mirror, the cursed mirror, began to glow, its surface pulsing with an unnatural light. The man's figure twitched violently, his movements jerky and erratic. His face twisted in a grotesque grimace, as if he was in pain, caught between worlds. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, everything stopped. The room was still. The mirror was silent. Melanie collapsed to the floor, exhausted and trembling. She could barely comprehend what had just happened. Had she broken the curse? Was the nightmare over? But as she looked up, her heart sank. The man's figure had disappeared, but his reflection remained. The room was eerily quiet. Melanie sat frozen on the floor, her back pressed against the cold wooden surface, her heart still pounding in her chest. The glow from the mirror had faded, but it didn't feel like the danger had passed. The reflection of the man in the glass lingered, his cold eyes fixed on her from within the confines of the polished surface. Melanie didn't dare approach it. She couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection was more real than anything else in the room. It was as though the man was waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for her to falter. But the longer she stared at the mirror, the more the reflection began to warp again. Slowly, the man's expression shifted, his cold, twisted smile returning. His eyes, which had once seemed hollow and distant, now appeared more alive, full of malice and anger. "You cannot escape what has already been set in motion," the reflection whispered, its voice carrying across the stillness of the room. Melanie recoiled, her heart hammering in her chest. This wasn't over. It couldn't be over. She had thought the incantation would sever the connection, but it seemed she had only disrupted the curse for a moment, giving the man time to regain his strength. Her pulse raced as she tried to think, tried to reason through what had happened. She needed answers. She needed a way to break free. The man in the mirror had been trapped for so long, but she wasn't sure what kind of power he held over her. What had she unleashed by reading that incantation? The room felt heavier now, the air thick with something malevolent. As Melanie looked around, she noticed that the once familiar walls of her apartment had begun to distort. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch further than they should have, and the light from the window grew dimmer, as though the sun itself was being swallowed by darkness. Suddenly she heard a sound, a faint scratching, like nails against glass. It was coming from the mirror. Without thinking, she jumped to her feet and rushed toward the mirror, her fingers trembling as they hovered near its edge. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. It was as if something on the other side was trying to break free. Melanie's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, her reflection still locked in place. She could see the distortion in the glass now, ripples running through it, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. The man's reflection started to shift, his features blurring, his face stretching and warping in unnatural ways. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the glass. It was cold, colder than it had ever been. The temperature in the room dropped significantly. and a sharp chill ran through her spine. Her fingers pressed harder against the glass, almost as if the surface itself was pulling her in, coaxing her to step closer. Then the mirror seemed to pulse, a brief flash of light rippling across its surface, and in that moment, Melanie saw something she had not noticed before, something that made her blood run cold. In the reflection, behind the man's distorted form, she could see the faint outlines of faces, other faces hidden in the shadows watching her. Dozens of eyes, staring at her with the same cold, calculating gaze as the man who had been haunting her. They were trapped there, just as he had been, and she realized in horror that the curse wasn't just bound to him. It was bound to the mirror itself. The faces in the glass seemed to move closer to her, their eyes following her every movement, their mouths stretching in silent screams. Melanie stumbled backward, gasping for air as she turned to run. But as she turned away, her eyes caught the glimpse of something else, something more chilling. The reflection in the mirror was no longer hers. It was a twisted version of herself, standing in the room behind her. Her reflection smiled at her, a dark, hollow grin that didn't belong to her. It was as if the man had somehow taken hold of her, using her own image against her. "You belong to me now," the reflection whispered in a voice that was both hers and not hers at the same time. Panic gripped her chest. She had to get out, but where? The door was just a few feet away, but it felt as though the air around her had thickened, as though the walls were closing in on her. She couldn't escape. The mirror was everywhere now. Melanie turned back to the mirror, her heart racing as she stared at the reflection of herself, the cursed version that stood before her. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The reality of it all crashed down on her. The man in the mirror was no longer a distant specter. He was here, with her, and he had taken her place. Desperation surged through her as she reached out for the mirror once more, her fingers scraping against the surface. She had to break free. She had to end this. But as her hand pressed harder into the glass, the mirror began to shift once more. This time, it wasn't just the reflection that changed. The glass itself cracked, fractures spreading across its surface like a web. And through the cracks, Melanie could see what was waiting for her on the other side. The figure of the man, his body twisted and contorted, stepped out of the shattered glass. He was free, but so was she. Melanie staggered backward, her heart pounding wildly in her chest as the man stepped out of the mirror. His form was no longer a mere reflection, but a real, tangible presence, dark and looming before her. His face, distorted with malevolence, stared at her with an intensity that froze her to the spot. The room seemed to tilt as he advanced, the air thickening with an oppressive energy that pushed against her chest. She could feel the temperature plummet, her breath becoming visible in the frozen air. The man's smile twisted into something grotesque, and as he took another step forward, his voice rang out, low and mocking. "Did you really think you could escape?" His voice was a guttural rasp, as though it had been pulled from the depths of hell itself. "You belong to me now, just as I belong to you." Melanie wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. The man's power seemed to draw her in, his presence suffocating and relentless. She could feel the pull of the mirror, as though it still controlled her, still held sway over her very soul. The man's figure loomed closer, his shadow stretching long across the room. And with each step he took, the room seemed to grow darker, the edges of the walls curling inward, closing off any means of escape. It was as though the space itself was being devoured by the curse. But then, as if in response to her terror, something shifted within her. Melanie could feel a spark of defiance flicker deep within her. She couldn't give in, not now, not after everything. She had to fight back. With all the strength she could muster, she lunged for the mirror, her fingers gripping its cold, fractured surface. She needed to break the connection, to end this nightmare once and for all. But as her hand closed around the mirror's edge, a force surged through her, slamming her back into the wall. The man's laughter echoed through the room, reverberating in her skull. "You can't break what has already been broken," he taunted, his eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. The reflection of herself in the shattered glass seemed to smirk, a cold, mocking grin that made her blood run cold. She had to act fast, before it was too late. Melanie's mind raced. The force pushing her back felt suffocating, like an invisible hand gripping her chest. But the flicker of defiance, that tiny spark she'd felt earlier, began to grow stronger. She couldn't just let the curse win. She couldn't let him take her too. The man's figure loomed ever closer, his movements slow and deliberate, like he knew she had nowhere to go. The air felt thick, pressing against her, choking her with the weight of inevitability. He was going to claim her. It was only a matter of time. But then, through the haze of fear and dread, a thought came to her. Something her grandmother had once said echoed in her mind. A mirror can only reflect what is seen. If you refuse to see it, you can control it. Control. That was it. She had been looking at the mirror for too long, letting herself get consumed by the images, the reflections. But the mirror only had power over her as long as she allowed it to. She had to stop seeing him. With all the strength she had left, Melanie clenched her eyes shut, forcing herself to stop looking at the mirror, at the man, at the distorted reflection. The darkness around her seemed to respond, the oppressive weight in the air lessening slightly as she turned her focus inward. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but she kept her eyes closed, her body trembling with fear. The man stopped. For a moment, the air felt still, and she dared to open her eyes just a crack. The reflection of the man in the mirror was frozen. He was standing there, his twisted smile still present, but he was no longer moving. His dark eyes were fixed on her, but it was like he couldn't reach her. He was trapped again, just as he had been before. Melanie's heart pounded in her chest, but the relief was brief. The reflection in the mirror was still there, still watching her. And she knew that, while the man had been contained for now, the curse was far from broken. She had only delayed it. The room seemed to pulse around her. The shadows stretched, then retracted, as if they too were waiting for something. Melanie's gaze flicked toward the door. She needed to leave, but she had no idea where she could go. The curse had followed her, and it was clear now that the mirror wasn't just a window to the past. It was a bridge between worlds. The man in the mirror began to move again, slowly, methodically. His fingers stretched, reaching through the cracks in the glass, and Melanie could feel his presence encroaching on her once more. He was trying to break free. She stumbled back, her legs unsteady beneath her as she made her way toward the door. But just as she reached for the handle, a shrill noise pierced the air, a sound that felt like nails scraping against her very soul. She screamed, but it was as though her voice was being swallowed by the room, by the mirror itself. She could feel the glass behind her, the jagged edges of the cracked surface pressing against her skin. The man was getting closer, his fingers almost through the mirror now. Desperation surged through her. She had to end it. She had to destroy the mirror. But she couldn't just smash it. No, it wouldn't work. It would only make things worse. Melanie's mind raced for a solution. She remembered something from the old book she had found, the one with the incantation that had brought the curse to life. It wasn't enough to destroy the mirror. She had to bind it, trap it. The man wasn't just a spirit. He was something darker, something older. His power was tied to the mirror, to the very glass. If she could bind him within the mirror, she could stop him once and for all. Melanie reached into her pocket, pulling out the tattered piece of paper she had found earlier. The ink was faded, barely legible in some spots, but she could still make out the words. She knew what she had to do. As the man's fingers pushed through the cracks, reaching for her, she began to speak the words from the incantation. Her voice was shaky at first, but it grew stronger as she repeated the words over and over, the rhythm of the chant gaining power with every syllable. The room seemed to vibrate with energy, the shadows in the corners of the room swirling as the mirror began to glow. The man in the reflection screamed, his distorted face contorting in rage as he tried to pull himself free. But Melanie could feel the energy building, wrapping around him like a tightening noose. His body twisted in the reflection, his form writhing as if in agony. The glass began to shimmer, crackling with an otherworldly energy. Melanie could feel it, too, the pull of the mirror, the connection between her and the cursed figure within it. But she couldn't stop now. She had to finish the incantation. With one final, forceful word, the room exploded in a burst of light. When the light faded, Melanie was on the floor, breathing heavily, her hands still clutching the incantation. The room was silent now, eerily so. She opened her eyes cautiously, half expecting the man to be standing over her, his cold eyes staring down at her. But there was nothing. For the first time since the curse had begun, the mirror was empty. The man was gone. The reflection was just her own. She sat up slowly, the weight of what had happened settling in. She had done it. She had broken the curse, or so she thought. The mirror was still cracked, its edges jagged, but the glass was no longer alive with energy. The malevolent force had been sealed, bound within the mirror. Melanie felt an uneasy sense of calm wash over her. But there was one thing she couldn't shake, a feeling that the mirror wasn't completely finished with her. She knew that the curse had been powerful, and that it had left its mark. The strange pull she'd felt, the connection between her and the man, it wasn't gone. Not entirely. As Melanie stood up and took a tentative step toward the mirror, she felt something shift. There, at the very edge of her vision, she saw something. A faint movement. A shadow. She turned her head sharply, but when she looked back at the mirror, everything seemed normal again. The man was gone, and there was no sign of the faces that had once haunted its depths. But the reflection, Melanie realized, was no longer entirely hers. The eyes staring back at her, were they really hers? Or had something been left behind? A trace, a remnant, a sliver of what had been. Melanie slowly backed away, her chest tightening with a cold sense of dread. The mirror was silent, the curse seemingly broken, but in her heart, she knew that something was still watching. And this time, it wasn't just through the glass.